First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the implementation of injury prevention programs specifically for ACL injuries. So there we go. So if we took a look at the research evidence, recently there have been a lot of systematic reviews that have shown us that neuromuscular training programs, so as we've just heard, the 11 plus, or it could be knee control or a similar program like that. If teams use them during the course of a season, uh, the evidence suggests that we might see roughly a 45 to 50% reduction in the risk of ACL injuries. That sounds really promising. And yet, we're still seeing headlines that suggest maybe those benefits that we're seeing in the research don't translate into practice. So, Avert, if you can click ahead, we're seeing headlines that suggest there's a tsunami of ACL injuries, particularly in women's football, or there's this crisis or epidemic of ACL injuries. And it becomes hard to reconcile. How does the research suggest that we have the tools to reduce these by upwards of 50%, but we're not seeing that translate into any real world reductions in the number of these injuries in practice? And one of the reasons for that, if we borrow from the field of implementation science, is that there's a bit of a downward slope when we take injury prevention programs out of the research, so these tightly controlled conditions where we see 40, 50% risk reductions, and kind of let them loose in the real world. And what we see are these things called scale up penalties. And the first is what we call voltage drop. And that's the idea that only some people will actually end up using that program in reality. And that's because only some people know about the program, or some people take a look at the program and decide, actually, no, that's not for us. The other thing we see is what we call program shift. And this is the idea that even amongst those people who do decide to use an injury prevention program, in a lot, if not every case, they end up adapting that program. So they'll swap out some of the exercises that they don't like in favor of ones that they prefer, or they might reduce the amount of time they spend doing the exercises. They might turn them into games, or in some other way change them to make them easier to incorporate into their normal training routines. Ultimately, the effect there is that outside of those controlled conditions, we start to see the programs have a little bit less effect. And ultimately, we have to start thinking a little bit about the psychology behind that. Why do we ever change our behavior? Why do we do the things that we do? And when we're talking about preventing ACL injuries, the research shows us that there are three basic conditions that have to be in place for anyone to even consider engaging in prevention behavior. So the first of these is risk perception. And so this is the idea that, number one, we have to have an awareness that there is an ACL injury risk, and we have to understand what our own personal risk of ACL injury might be. If we don't think we're at risk, we're very unlikely to take preventative steps. The second condition that has to be met is we have to believe that the injury prevention program or strategy has a likely impact on our risk of injury. So we have to believe that it's going to have an effect on the outcome. And the third condition that has to be in place is self-efficacy. So we might think we're at risk of an ACL injury. We might believe that this training program or this warm-up has a good chance of preventing those injuries. But if we're not confident, we don't have the self-efficacy that we can do the exercises correctly or incorporate them into our normal training routines, again, we're not going to consider taking on board that injury prevention program. So we won't form an intention to do so. Now, the evidence also suggests that Intentions don't always lead to behavior. So, anybody who's ever made a New Year's resolution probably knows this all too well. We start out the new year suggesting to ourselves that, no, this is the year I'm going to spend more time away from my desk out in nature. I'm going to get on top of that project that I've been working on. Or even on a day to day basis, we start to think a little bit about, I'm going to stay on top of the housework, or I'm going to do all of those little jobs that I've been promising myself that I was going to do. Inevitably, what happens is life gets in the way. Other priorities start to take precedence, or barriers come up, challenges that we didn't expect. And ultimately, we might have the best intentions in the world, but we don't end up following through on them. What does that mean then in terms of prevention behavior? Well, even if we do form those intentions to, say, adopt the 11 plus, the realities of actually using it can pose new barriers as well. And this is a quote from a coach that I've worked with. Now, within the 11 plus, as players become more proficient with the exercises, there are additional levels that you can move up to, make the exercises more challenging and interesting for the players. But that in itself posed a problem because for this coach, the program kept changing. They had to remember all of the new exercises. They had to remember all of the new coaching cues and types of feedback to give to the athletes. And it meant that they had to keep changing themselves, which is ultimately why they took the program and adapted it to make their own version of it that they could keep consistent throughout the year and didn't have to keep changing. So it's not just about forming an intention to use these programs, it's actually about following through and getting over the barriers that arise along the way. Next slide, please. The important thing to remember is that there are always going to be barriers to doing ACL injury prevention. So when you talk to footballers, their coaches, the administration at the club, even for young footballers, their parents, the reason they're there is for performance. It's about winning, it's about pushing their skills to the next level. And if performance is the priority, oftentimes injury prevention kind of gets relegated to those few spare moments they have during the week. And attached to this are some other barriers around resource. The primary one that we see is time. For example, if you're in a team that trains an hour at a time, it's a big ask to give up 20 minutes of that training time to do an injury prevention warm-up program. So teams are unlikely to do that. Or they might be operating in an environment that doesn't have a lot of resource, be that facilities or equipment or coaching expertise, in order to implement those programs successfully. Some other common barriers that we might see within clubs, there are often a lot of different people who have an opinion about what injury prevention should be done. And when you get a lot of those different opinions in conflict with each other, sometimes it results in nothing being done instead of upsetting one person or another. Or player behavior can be really difficult to predict. So sometimes players buy into injury prevention and they're really keen to do the programs. But if you turn up as a coach or a medic and you're trying to lead a warm-up and the players have absolutely no interest in doing it, you're going to have a really difficult time, not only to get the exercises done, but to get the quality of movement that's required in order to see a benefit. And of course, one of the biggest barriers we see is that the evidence says that we should be seeing a 40-50% reduction in the number of ACL injuries if we do this program. Well, if you start using it at the start of a season and you actually end up with 1 or 2 ACL injuries in your team, you're going to say, well, this program is no good. It doesn't work. We're going to stop doing it. So there are always going to be these barriers in place. And we also have to remember that what we think of is ideal conditions. So on the left side of your screen, you see an image from the original 11 plus. This is what they imagined it would be like to do some of these exercises, but the environment isn't always conducive to that. And on the right, that's the reality of recreational girls soccer in Canada, where you actually have to shovel the snow off the pitch in order to do the exercises. And so we can design the best programs in the world, but the reality is that teams are competing within an environment that doesn't always support the use of those programs. So, what do we do about this? So, if we know that these conditions have to be in place for people to form an intention, but we know that intentions don't always lead to behavior, we need to put something in place in between. And those things are what we call action plans. Now, we know that people form action plans when they decide who is going to lead the injury prevention, who's going to be responsible for it, when are we going to do it, where are we going to do it, and if we miss doing it at 1 or 2 sessions, how do we get back on the wagon and start doing it again? And we know from research that I've done and others that people who form strong intentions to use the program in the preseason are 4 times more likely to stick with it throughout the season. But ultimately, those who have action plans, so concrete ideas about who, what, when, and where, are 3 times more likely. And so the key here is to not only figure out a way to build intentions, but also figure out a way to build action plans to turn those intentions into behavior. So next slide, please. One way that we can do this, and there's quite a bit of research around it now, is through workshops. These are typically delivered to players, oftentimes at coaches, but any sort of team meeting or other venue might work for this as well. And the way we've done it in practice is, number one, sit down and try to develop accurate risk awareness and set realistic expectations about what an injury prevention program might be able to bring to the team. Now, this might be in terms of medical needs, so actual injury risk reduction, but you also might consider the performance benefits that come from doing the program, or actually at the upper end, the elite end of the spectrum, how much salary are you going to save when you have all of your players available for selection because they aren't injured? The second piece, and really the key to driving behavior, is building self-efficacy. And the evidence shows us that that is the primary reason that people don't engage in injury prevention. And so this might be going out on the pitch to actually spend time coaching the exercises, practicing them, get to know what it feels like to do the exercises correctly and incorrectly, get practice in delivering feedback to athletes, just as we heard Anna speak about, or it might be actually going out into the community and building a network of coaches who are all using the same or similar approaches and learn lessons from each other. And finally, it's about sitting down and making those concrete action plans. Now, in a workshop, you might sit around as a round table with everybody at the club who's involved to think about that plan. But it also might take the form of individual brainstorming about what are the likely barriers I'm going to encounter and what are my strategies for getting over those. Or it might, again, be about relying on a network of coaches within the club or coaches in the wider community to share strategies, give each other feedback on how the implementation is going, and try to troubleshoot when things don't go quite according to plan. So we also have to remember that whilst our tendency is to try to implement injury prevention strategies with the athletes and their coaches, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are primarily going to be responsible on a day-to-day basis for injury prevention. They don't exist in a vacuum. And so we have the athlete, but outside of that, they also exist within the context of their club, their local governing body, potentially a national or international governing body, and the culture of football in their part of the world. And all of those exert an influence on injury prevention behavior. Now, some of them are really supportive. So, for example, you might be lucky enough to be at working within a governing body that they have policies in place to help implement injury prevention strategies. Or some influences can actually be barriers. So you might be at a club, for example, where there isn't a lot of resource available to put into injury prevention. And so whatever strategy you intend to use is ultimately going to be influenced by the wider context that you're working with. So on the next slide, the real important point here is that it's not just about individual behavior. It's not about an athlete deciding, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do the 11 plus, or a coach saying that I'm going to implement this with my team for the season because I think it's really important. Those systems and structures have to be in place to support that behavior change. It's a bit like expecting coaches and athletes to get on with their task while there's a tornado raging around them. And so we ultimately have to think about who are all the stakeholders who have an influence on injury prevention, and can we actually get everybody moving in more or less the same direction in order to make this successful. So, what does that look like in practice? And I'll finish up with the idea of ACL injuries are kind of a wicked problem. And by that, I mean that we're dealing with an injury that in itself occurs for very complex reasons, and no two injury incidents are exactly alike. So, that makes it complicated to prevent them. But we also have to remember that every single team in the world is operating in a very unique context. They have their own resources, their own challenges, and ultimately their own priorities as well. And so, what I'd like to propose is that there is no one size fits all solution for preventing ACL injuries. And instead of thinking about, can we find what is the best prevention program, what is the best prevention strategy, I would argue that the best prevention strategy is the one that you're actually going to use. It's the one that fits your needs, that fits with your priorities, and ultimately fits into the context where you're trying to work. And so there are lots of different possible solutions that we might actually end up finding along the way, on the principle that doing something is better than doing nothing. And so ultimately, it's down to every team, every coach, every medical provider, every athlete to figure out what's going to work for me, what meets my needs, what fits within my context, and ultimately, what can I stick with for the duration of the season in order to give me the best preventative bang for my buck. And so I think that's where I'll leave you for today.